I'll have you state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
For the record, I'm Doug Goehring, North Dakota Agriculture Commissioner. My last name is spelled Goehring, sometimes pronounced Goehring, where I have relatives down here and south of the border too.
And Commissioner, were you in the room when I went through the penalties for perjury earlier this morning?
I was Judge Hogan, and I'm not lying about my name.
Great. And I assume you understand what perjury is?
Yes, I do.
With that in mind, do you promise to tell the truth this morning?
I do.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
Well, good morning, Judge Hogan, commissioners and panelists. As I've already stated, I'm Doug Goehring, North Dakota Agriculture Commissioner. I have been receiving in the last, probably in the last year and a half, numerous emails and documents and calls and visitations from concerned citizens, landowners, farmers, and ranchers. And probably in the last couple of weeks, I have received numerous emails, documents, probably at this point about 1.25 inches thick. So there's a lot, plus numerous calls. I can't even return all of them or could even tell you how many they've been. But I have compiled a lot of the questions, a lot of the concerns that have been stated to me. Thought about them, and I believe the best use of my time would probably be to come here, convey some of that, offer a solution, offer a way in which one could potentially mitigate. I'm not saying it's going to be cheap, but it's just my opinion. I'm in the problem-solving business, and the fact that we do run the pipeline remediation reclamation program, we have some knowledge with how you would mitigate and how you manage through some of the pipeline issues. But it's still up to the PSC and whatever arrangements can be made to address a lot of these things. So again, it's our opinion, my opinion, and I'll just share that today. And although we're not here to discuss the merits of CO2 in a pipeline, I will go on record with my objections. This administration and some in Washington and the European Union have all taken a position that CO2 is a harmful greenhouse gas, that it's toxic, and it should be regulated. Although issues have been raised about methane as another greenhouse gas, no one's really discussed the most prevalent greenhouse gas in the entire world. It's water vapor. In fact, I will tell you that CO2 is essential for life and supports vegetative growth, which in turn absorbs sunlight, supporting more vegetation, photosynthesis, and creates more habitat on our world. CO2 in itself provides great value to the earth, to the climate, society, and all living things. But I'll move on from those concerns and talk about the pipeline, talk about concerns with construction, the route, reclamation, and safety. I don't intend to get down into the weeds. If there's questions, I can elaborate more on that, but I'll just make some overarching, broader statements. First of all, the pipeline depth has a concern with many, including myself, but to avoid unintended contact with equipment or the heat that will impact vegetative growth on the surface and the subsoil, the depth should be 4 feet or greater. The deeper, the better. I also believe we need some assurances concerning proper separation of topsoil and subsoil. I see this quite often in the work that we already work on. We need the same care and consideration when backfilling the pipe, where the subsoil would go in first, and making sure that there's no mixing with the topsoil. I would also suggest that proper nutrients are applied afterwards to enhance quicker recovery for forages and to avoid any significant crop production losses. In fact, an application of manure on all pipeline paths and then within that construction area would actually reintroduce a lot more biological activity that's been disturbed and soil structure has been destroyed during that period of time. It just takes time for it to recoup and regenerate. So any of those types of activities, any of those things that can be done to enhance the soil will certainly minimize the impact back to the landowner, the farmer, the rancher, whether they're growing forages or they're growing crops. Compaction is also an issue, and this has got a couple different issues, a couple different roles in which we'd have to consider. But first of all, when we're talking about surface compaction, we need to consider how wide that construction easement is, and also work with soil scientists, work with the landowners, work with the farmers and the ranchers. Understand that soils are part of the issue here. Moisture is part of the issue. So is the timing. What part of the season are we doing this? But consider applying gypsum. And in some soils that works really well. Gypsum doesn't always address compaction issues, but in many cases it certainly can. But manure and ripping certainly are good ways in which to mediate compaction and start to address soil issues. Wherever it's applicable, it would help alleviate some of the problems. Concerns have also been raised about a breakage in the line or a rapid release. I guess along those lines, and I heard it stated that I was referring to them as check valves, but I think there was a reference made to block valves and the distances that exist between these block valves. I would, and I know this would be rather extensive, so again, it's just my opinion, thinking about CO2, its atomic weight compares to methane, natural gas, which is much lighter and will just dissipate into the air. CO2 tends to follow the contour of the land and go to lower areas. If you're out in areas where you have very few rural residents or inhabitants, it's probably all right to have check valves every so many miles. But when we start thinking about inhabited areas, we start thinking about those more urban populated areas. Instead of miles, we might want to think about thousands of feet where we would have block valves in. A rapid release would immediately shut the pipeline down, and it would minimize very little exposure probably to the public. But there's something else to consider here, and that's maybe mapping the elevation of the route and areas that are adjacent to it. I wouldn't be concerned with 100 people living on top of a hill next to a pipeline as much as I'd be concerned about someone a mile away in the lowest part or in a ravine where you may have several homes. You're likely to have more issues there and have to consider where you're going to have block valves in to help mitigate and minimize any potential harm or effects. I throw these out. I'm not in charge here, but I'm just bringing some solutions forward instead of just criticism and pointing out that I may or may not like this project. I may or may not like the fact the federal government calls CO2 a bad thing. But at least I want to put something on the table for everyone's consideration. Moving on, the one issue that has been raised quite frequently with me, and it has to do with tiling. In the last 20 years, we've had more and more tiling projects in North Dakota, And although there may be very little here in Emmons County, I know that the pipeline route has considerable amount of tiling areas or tiled fields which will be potentially crossed. This is one time when you want to make sure that if you are cutting through tile, there has to be proper compaction underneath that tile line so that we can avoid any sagging or future breakage. Now, I have asked someone about this issue. There's a liability here if 10 years down the road that line breaks or all of a sudden it's not working properly. And they have asserted that they would make sure, because it's their pipeline, they would make sure that that line is fixed, repaired, and that it operates and functions the way it's supposed to. If you provide me that assurance, the same assurance they have, and our farmers can be assured that their system that they spent an inordinate amount of money to put in place will operate and function the way in which it was designed, you'll probably be able to eliminate a lot of their fears over this also. But that has probably been one of the bigger issues I've heard from those producers, those landowners that have made such an investment with tile lines, is they want assurances that no matter what, it operates and functions the way that it was meant to, the way that it was put in the ground. So if we can address some of those things, I believe it'll help with those producers and landowners that have invested so much in the tile line side. With that, I appreciate your time, and I'll stand for any questions. I know you have a lot of people that want to speak today, so like I said, I wasn't going to elaborate unless you asked me.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bender, any questions?
Thank you, Commissioner, for your time, and I don't have any questions.
Mr. Pelham?
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't have any questions either.
Mr. Bakke?
Surprisingly, I do.
Surprises nobody.
Commissioner Goehring, could you turn to Exhibit 159 in the binder there? They're all labeled. I think it's on your left-hand side.
$159?
159.
I have it here.
So that's a brochure from a company called Lindy, who is in the pipeline industry, and it has safety advice for carbon dioxide. And if you turn to page 2 of that document, it talks about there's a summary of likely health effects, CO2 by volume. And it talks about, and first of all, am I correct in understanding you understand this CO2 pipeline that Summit wants to install would be 100% carbon dioxide?
Correct.
By volume?
What I understand, yep.
Okay. And this talks about the health effects at different exposure levels by volume, 3% of carbon dioxide exposure to someone, the gas is weakly narcotic at this level, giving rise to deeper breathing, reduced hearing ability, coupled with a headache, increase in blood pressure and pulse rate, 4 to 5% volume carbon dioxide exposure, stimulation of respiratory center occurs in deeper and more rapid breathing, signs of intoxication become evident after 30 minutes of exposure, 5 to 10% exposure of carbon dioxide. Breathing becomes more laborious with headache and loss of judgment. And if the carbon dioxide exposure of this 100% carbon dioxide to someone is between 10%, even as low as 10%, if it increases above 10%, unconsciousness will occur in under 1 minute. And unless prompt action is taken, further exposure to these high levels will eventually result in death. Were you aware of this danger posed by the the CO2?
Yes, I'm aware of what CO2 does, yes.
So, understanding that, do you agree that this CO2 pipeline should not be built near populated areas such as Bismarck?
I believe there's ways in which one can mitigate the risk or should look at to mitigate. I'm not here to decide where it should actually go. Do I believe any place you put it, somebody's going to be inconvenienced? Is there a way to minimize and mitigate that? I believe so. I know that that's what all of you are charged with.
Okay. Well, and you talked about these block valves, and I think you said you believe in populated areas, these block valves should be thousands of feet apart?
I believe they should. If I'm looking at how to mitigate a project and mitigate the risk with the concerns that have been brought forth to me, I'm finding ways in which, let's face it, if something's going to happen, how can I best minimize that impact?
Sure. And one way, because as an example, Summit proposes in their pipeline route to run this pipeline through north and east, to the north and east of Bismarck, within 2 miles of 3 existing public schools. Were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't. I'm not really necessarily sure where the pipeline route is. I know of all the people that have contacted me, and I have an idea of where they live, so I have a general idea and area, but I wasn't sure.
Okay. Were you aware that there's 1,250 911 call locations within 2 miles of this pipeline, meaning those are residences or offices or occupied buildings?
I'm aware of all the residents that reside around the Bismarck-Mandan area. I reside around that same area.
Sure. And don't you agree that there'd be much less risk? We could mitigate the risk by moving this some substantial distance away from the city of Bismarck?
I don't disagree, but it's not my option, or it's not for me to say where it gets moved to, but I'm going to point out where I may have concerns with where it's at. That's up to the commission to decide where it may need to move to or where the route is. I came here with something that I deal with and do every day, which is I try to find solutions to problems. How do I best mitigate to minimize impact and effects? Knowing that sometimes in the world I live and work in, there aren't very many options. Things exist, things happen. How do I best manage through that?
Has Summit ever come and spoken to you about any mitigation efforts they're willing to consider to reduce the risk to the public due to this proposed CO2 pipeline?
Summit has visited with me. I wouldn't say necessarily about mitigation. They asked if I had any questions, if I had any concerns. They did approach me early on and ask if I would consider using my pipeline reclamation remediation program in this situation. I did share with them that it's a little bit different circumstance and situation. In the pipeline reclamation remediation program, the reason it exists is because in oil and gas country, mineral owners have a constitutional right to develop their minerals. In doing so, you are imposing a pipeline on a surface owner. And many times, I shouldn't say many times, often there is issues and concerns with how that pipeline is going in or what may have happened. Our job was to intervene, to mediate, and to point out ways in which we can mitigate the situation, we can minimize the impact, we could help the surface owner, and still accomplish what the operator and the mineral owner are trying to accomplish, which is to develop those minerals and then make sure that that oil and gas makes it to a processing facility or a major transmission line, pipeline. Those are a little bit different than what we're dealing with here. Here we have a private company that needs to negotiate with landowners to determine what's the best path forward. That's not to say that we couldn't, if asked, potentially intervene and mediate, but here's the problem. One thing, when that program was developed and the legislature had us do that back in 2012, I stated right away, and the legislative intent exists, that states we are not to negotiate contracts. I won't negotiate a contract between a landowner and a company. We can help point out some things about how wide that construction easement should be, some things to consider when you want to mitigate, and how that soil should be put back in place. There's a lot of things we can address, but in most cases, when it comes down to this pipeline route or one that exists in western North Dakota, we're only going to get involved in sort of the mechanics and the mitigation and the impacts. We aren't going to get involved in trying to negotiate the contract or state whether you should or shouldn't. Sure. I'm going to respect a person's rights in doing that.
Sure. And you mentioned mineral owners and their right to develop their mineral interests.
Constitutional right, yes.
And the effect on surface owners. But this is a different situation with this CO2 pipeline, because basically that CO2 is not something where somebody's going to sell that, make money off it like minerals, provide a fuel for vehicles, fuel for homes, anything like that. This is essentially a waste product primarily coming from other states to be dumped in North Dakota, isn't it?
What I would state, this is my opinion, the federal government has deemed CO2 to be a harmful substance that needs to be regulated, or at least they'll compensate you for managing it in a certain way. Whether I agree with that or not, they've already set the framework in place to address the issue, and in the federal government's eyes, they see a benefit to capturing CO2 and sequestering it.
Sure, and I understand the rationale, but you would agree this is not a product that can be sold or burned or used at the end point. It's strictly something that doesn't have any commercial value to be used by anybody, at least at this point, at the area where it's going into the ground.
Presently, no, because most of the statements have been made that it's going to be sequestered for forever. Now, when the payments run out, any CO2 that's coming to North Dakota, I would hope get used for the first intended use. When I became commissioner, we started down this path of looking at sequestering carbon dioxide, but for two main reasons. One was to preserve and protect our coal-fired electric generation facilities. The second thing was to use it for enhanced oil recovery, because it's a great substance in that. What's happened in between is this program was developed that said, we're going to sequester CO2 and you're going to have to do it for a minimum of 12 years. And we're going to pay you $50, $55 a ton. Now, congressional action has moved it to $80 a ton. But after 12 years, any of that product that is coming to North Dakota, any product that's being sequestered in North Dakota, I would hope we turn around and use it for enhanced oil recovery, tertiary recovery of our oil and gas reserves that exist in geology in the state of North Dakota. That was the intended use originally.
But whether that ever is going to come to fruition, we don't know.
I would agree, but I would suspect after 12 years, why else would you be moving it to spend that kind of money to move it into a formation other than our companies could take benefit of that and we could turn around and utilize it for oil and gas recovery?
This $80 a ton, that $80.
Excuse me.
Your Honor, I don't mean to interrupt the questioning, but we're getting a bit off track here. I mean, this is a siting hearing for the line, and we're not here to talk about the policies behind it. In all due respect to Commissioner Goehring, I think he did indicate that in his testimony. But I think further questioning on this, we want to hear about this project, whether or not this project here and now is something that's to be cited in North Dakota or not. So I'd ask that we move to questions that are related to this project and not the policies behind carbon capture that this commission has no jurisdiction whatsoever. The federal government has decided these policies and they just don't relate to this commission.
And I can move on. I just have one question on the economic benefit he mentioned.
Hang on a sec, Commissioner. Did you?
Yes, I was going to say the same thing. I think we need to.
Okay, so you only have one other question because I think we are beyond the scope of what Commissioner Goehring intended this morning.
So, Commissioner Goehring, you heard from Ms. Schonert about the issue with landowners being able to have liability insurance coverage if this CO2 pipeline is on their land. Is that of concern?
At one time, I was the president of the state's largest domestic insurance company, and I think some things can be misconstrued, and I'm not really sure. It depends on what you're asking for. Can you insure someone else's liability? No. Summit's responsible and liable for their pipeline. Now, if you damaged it, there's the process there in an investigation. They're going to try and determine and figure out who's going to be paying what expenses to repair it. But pipelines go across my property. My insurance company hasn't denied me liability insurance because that pipeline's there. As long as I'm having normal agricultural activities and practices on that ground, I'm safe, I'm fine. If I do something that creates a liability, my insurance company probably isn't going to like it. But I don't know the situation because I don't know what you're trying to insure for. That would be the concern in the question.
So whether you would have a concern or not, you need more information to know?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Leibel, any questions?
I have no questions.
Mr. Paranis?
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. I appreciate your comments. Kevin Paranis for Minnesota, North Dakota. Our members build pipelines, and I think we agree overwhelmingly or entirely with the comments that you made. And I just want to briefly talk about a couple of them. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that we can focus here on mitigation of risk and mitigation of impacts, understanding that there will always be some impacts and risk. Is that correct?
Yes, I don't think you can completely eliminate risk. And let's just say if I have to operate in a world where this is going to happen, what can I do to mitigate and minimize any of those impacts? So that's generally the world that I get presented every day. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to just come forward and bring criticism for everything you're doing. At least I should be offering something that provides value, usefulness, and also addresses people's concerns, because I do have a responsibility there. And that's what I've tried to bring forward.
Thank you.
How can we alleviate that?
Thank you. And I heard you reference at least two sort of what I would consider types of mitigation. One was we could call it engineering in terms of what actually gets built. I think you specifically mentioned block valves. There's, I suppose, the depth of cover question, right? How it's designed. and that's one area of mitigation. And the second area of mitigation I think I heard you describing was about the way that the pipeline is built. In other words, how it's the techniques that are used to actually install it and what sorts of impacts that have. Is that a fair characterization?
It is, and it's exactly when I worked construction, we did pipelines, water lines, and how you managed and cared for putting that back in, how you were backfilling, how you were treating the whole project, generally meant whether you had a water leak there or not. Not all the time, but in some cases, your care and consideration meant something.
That is exactly our experience. And so specifically in terms of construction, I heard you list topsoil separation as one of the issues of concern. I heard you reference compaction in terms of what the sort of impacts are on the soil. I heard a reference to drain tile damage. I guess the question would be, are those some of the priority areas, and are there any other priority areas in terms of how the pipeline is built that you think that should be managed in this process to minimize risk and damage?
I will say, as a landowner and a farmer, anytime you go on anybody's property, treat it with the utmost respect. How would you want that land to come back into condition, knowing that pipeline's going to go through here? I would take the utmost care to make sure that when you're taking the topsoil off, that it is in and out here, it's measured in inches and sometimes just a few inches. I'd just make sure that that is over here in one area, that subsoil does not come in contact with it, and it's the very first thing that goes back in. And when you're dealing with rocks, make sure those rocks are removed from that backfill to the greatest degree. I mean, you can't have them within a foot of anything that's going to be next to that pipe. And then put that topsoil back on. The last thing, and then if you can, apply some manure. Apply some of the basic nutrients, N, P, and K, some of the micronutrients. Help that soil to recover as quickly as possible. They are going to be, and even though they're being compensated for surface damages, for the loss of forages and crop that are there, try to help them recover that as quickly as possible so it doesn't minimize their bottom line and their operation. And then do a good job cleaning it up. Remove the rocks. I don't care if they were underneath, they end up on top. Remove them, take them to a rock pile. Work with the landowner, respect them, and you'll probably may not have a friend at the end of the day, but at least they won't be an enemy.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just one last question. Would you agree that it's important that the workers, having done this work yourself, that the workers performing this work have the necessary skills and experience to know what to do correctly and to be able to perform that work correctly? For example, to recognize where the topsoil changes to subsoil.
Yeah, and I got some funny stories to go along with that I'm not very happy to share. But yeah, when people are out there doing the work and you're an operator, you got topsoil here and you have subsoil here, and you go when you're backfilling and you just blend it and mix it all together and throw it back in the hole, I don't think you're very competent. I think the company needs to find someone new to do the work. But yeah, competent people will go a long ways.
Thank you, Commissioner. That's all.
Commissioner Chrisman?
I really appreciate you being here today to give us some of your insight on ag and also another topic. You were a little modest. You talked about your ag work, but as Ag Commissioner, you also joined the Attorney General and Governor as members of the Industrial Commission, correct?
Correct.
And we have this kind of a mixed bag of responsibilities, especially with oil and gas, where, for instance, Industrial Commission cites drilling things, the PSC cites pipelines and natural gas processing plants and things like that, correct?
Correct.
And then you alluded to this part in, I can't remember what year it was, I think you said 2012, you developed that ombudsman program on some of these pipeline projects where there was dissatisfaction from landowners, correct?
Correct. Commissioner Chrisman, legislators knew there was a growing tension and anxiety out there. And in 2012, there were suggestions that the only way to resolve this is we got to have some type of program, and they came to me. And because the Industrial Commission oversees the gathering lines, not the transmission lines, but the gathering lines, that's where we played that critical role then in intervening, mediating, and help bringing some resolution to the table.
Okay, and so that's about when I left the legislature and came to this responsibility. So I've never really known how that works out. I mean, no one can ever satisfy everybody completely, but are you usually able to come to some kind of resolution on those complaints, or does it often just end up at loggerheads, or how has it worked?
It's actually been very successful. Probably the first year and probably the first 4 public meetings we had, it brought 400 or 500 people into the room, and we had landowners, farmers, ranchers, we had companies. And one of the things, I didn't walk in with a bias, or I tried to remove that bias and be objective, but I tried to look at it from both points of view. We had companies that their reputations were being ruined. They were hurt. They were frustrated that they're being treated like this and called a lot of names. But when you really dug into it, what you found out, the companies didn't want their reputations smeared or ruined. They wanted to have a good relationship and do a good job. But they hired contractors and subcontractors. Contractors and subcontractors don't care about the company's reputation. They don't care anything about the company. All they care about is doing their work. So what was happening is there was poor work being done, or they were being disrespectful to the landowners out there, and it was causing tensions, it was causing problems. On the opposite side of that, we had landowners that sometimes had bad days. I'll give you a quick one. I have a gentleman one morning, gets up, feeds cows, middle of winter, busted an axle on the front end of his tractor. He's got a heifer going into labor. He's got to take it to the vet. Neighbor just brought back the auger, which, by the way, it had a twisted PTO shaft, but he hit the dog on the way in, so now the dog's got to go to the vet. He walks in the house. He's not having the greatest day, and mom burned the toast again. It's like, for God's sakes. And here comes a landman that drives in the yard and wants to talk to him about getting an easement to put a pipeline, a gathering line across. And this is the nicest guy in the world, yet he blew up at the landman. So then the company's like, well, he's just a rotten SOB and you can't get along with him. I said, you have no idea what he went through that day, though. Go back and visit with him. Go back and talk to him. Just don't come in with this preconceived notion of what you believe people are like or what they're going through. Try to relate in their point of view. And when you do that with both sides, it took about 3 months to resolve a lot of this. Within several months, we had people that were using my name in vain because they just call the company and say, are you guys going to come out and address this issue I've had for a couple of years? And when they said, otherwise we're going to call the commissioner, they were out there within a couple of days. So it got resolved on its own.
Glad that's working. So most of our transmission siting has been in the west, like you were talking about, didn't have to do with tiling. This is kind of new. Did you hear at all our testimony that we had in Wapaton on tiling?
No, I didn't.
So much of the discussion, we brought someone in from the Ag Extension Service, and the company had a tiling company there. And a lot of the discussion had to do with corrugated sleeves that the splices would go into to give it extra support.
Oh, that'd be good.
You mentioned thorough compaction below. And you also mentioned long-term assurances of the quality of the splices. Does that pretty well cover what we should know, do you think, about dealing with a pipeline crossing tiled fields?
Backfilling is still going to be a concern because of that structure that's been ruined within that soil when you've actually removed it and then put it back in. So just making sure that there's some care and consideration that's going back into that backfilling. That's such a big, important part. It's not saying that it won't settle out, that there won't be issues. Just work with landowners to make sure that they're trying to remediate that as best they can.
And you've addressed a number of the other questions I had, but kind of one of the last ones that we've heard a fair amount of in public testimony through this had to do with a perception that, I guess there's two more things I want to address. But one of them, a perception that there will be a significant loss of land value. With the pipelines that we have done in the past and your work within the agricultural industry, do you notice that there's a perceptible reduction in land value when transactions take place if there's a pipeline involved underneath it as opposed to if there isn't?
I've heard this a lot, and it really has more to do with the use. I mean, if you're going to try and establish and zone something rural residential and do a little mini development out there, yeah, you're going to devalue that. That's not going to be a prime piece of property to do that in. But when it comes to most agricultural practices, systems, farming and ranching, you shouldn't have a problem if you're remediating the site properly.
And then the previous testimony had to do with not being able to rent out their ag land, and I didn't catch if that was pasture or cropland, so I guess I'm asking about both. But have you ever heard of people being unable to rent their land out to other ag producers because there's a pipeline underneath?
No, I haven't heard of that. I think from what I gathered, and again, I shouldn't do this because it's making an assumption, but it appeared as though, well, there's a concern with having liability insurance. Again, if you're renting to someone, your liability insurance doesn't cover them anyways. They're liable for their actions and any of their equipment. I think it's kind of difficult that if you have something in the ground or something you're liable for, you're liable. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If someone puts a pipeline there, or just like there's a water line that goes through my property, they're liable. Now, if I do something to intentionally damage that, or if there is damage to it because of something I've done above, there's probably going to be an investigation, and there's going to be a lot of questions, and there's going to be some determinations that are made. There might even be some civil action that may result in some of that. But I think it comes down to what are you trying to insure, what type of liability you're trying to cover that would then put an owner of that land or an insurance company in a position to say they will or won't insure. I can't go and insure your house. I can only insure my house.
I don't have any other questions, but I do thank you, Commissioner, for taking time to be here and provide information for us.
Commissioner Haugen-Hoffert?
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. I do have a couple questions for you. You were in the room earlier today when they talked about a study on the frost heave. It's Exhibit 162.
I heard him talk about it, yes.
Okay. In your practices as a commissioner or in your farming practices, have you ever experienced or seen frost heave?
I wouldn't necessarily say frost heave. I've seen frost go down considerably. But there's always so many different factors you have to consider. What amount of vegetation or litter is above the ground in the winter before you actually get cold. Secondly, how much snow cover there is. Third, soil is a big deal. The more coarse your soil is, the more apt you are to have freezing further down. Moisture in the soil. There's so many different factors. But one thing to remember about a pipeline, whether you're talking an oil pipeline or a gas line or even this CO2 pipeline, they all generate heat also. So the deeper the better, but if you're at a 4-foot distance, the heat that's around that pipeline is going to help prevent some of that frost from going down that deep. But to that point, I'll also raise another issue we found. Where you have a pipeline, and there's some different factors that affect this, but you'll see in a drought, right over that pipeline, the crops will be shorter. And part of it is due to the fact that you have a warmer soil deeper down there. You may not have the same root structure that's going down that deep. And when you have a lack of moisture, you're just going to see that area probably impacted more. And it could be with how it's remediated also. So I threw a lot of things on the table for you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you did. So let's break it down a little bit for me. So let's say the frost that we were first talking about in the pipeline be 4 feet, and the frost goes down. The impacts on that frost can be what, have you seen, on the pipeline?
Well, I can only address what I've seen in water lines where going across the middle of the yard where it's bare, and we found out it was only like 6.5 feet deep. That's an area where that type of soil, that condition, that situation, it froze and broke a pipeline. So then you got to get a backhoe out and you got to fix it.
Okay.
And dig back a ways so you can start to get it a little bit lower.
So you have seen a broken pipeline from that?
Yes.
Okay.
We've had it on the farm.
Okay. I don't think you've had a chance to read this study, but based on the testimony today, is there anything that you didn't agree with as far as hearing that based on the evidence of this study?
Commissioner Hoffert, I haven't read the study,
Okay.
so I'm not sure. I would be disingenuous if I were to make way too many more comments about the study. I can tell you about personal experience, but I don't know if I can necessarily get into this. I can only give you my opinion as to what I know, how frost reacts in the state of North Dakota under different conditions, situations. We just went through this last winter where we got snow in October.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have frost 6 inches. So, I mean, when it started to melt, a lot of this snow actually went into the ground this year. So
And that was a good thing.
it was.
Okay, I'm going to go on, but thank you. You did give us some insight into your professional opinion on frost. So my other question is, you indicated that the pipeline depth 4 feet or greater would be the benefit. And I'm just going to read a little bit of the application so you understand what they submitted, and then ask you a question about farming practices around that. So in North Dakota, the pipeline will be installed at a minimum of 48 inches below the ground surface and will cross primarily agriculture in undeveloped lands. It will be increased to 60 inches at water body and drainage ditch crossings. Additionally, the depth to cover will be increased to 72 inches at underdeveloped section lines per North Dakota Public Service requirements. So that is the current depth of the pipeline in this application. And it meets what you suggested, 4 feet or greater. With the current depth of the pipeline, and you referenced it that you have a pipeline on your land in your farming practices, would you see the current depth of the pipeline as applied would have any impacts on farming practices?
No, because in most situations, even across the United States of America, even rippers are not going to go any deeper than 27 inches. And even at that, if you think about major utilities, and you guys would know this, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking about utilities that are in at 30 and 36 inches. So you're already getting a little dangerous at a ripper that someone may drop in the ground at 27. I'm not saying it happens very often. I'm saying that there are a few occasions where there's some equipment that they've used to rip deep in some fields.
Okay. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Dawson, any questions?
Judge, Commissioner, thank you for coming today. I have no questions for you.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Goehring.
Thank you.